The atmosphere begins its descent into madness not with a bang, but with a silent, invisible betrayal of the laws of motion. One moment, the world is anchored by the steady, rhythmic pulse of rotation that has governed every biological and geological process for 4,500,000,000 years. The next, the planet beneath our feet simply ceases its eastward journey. But the air does not. Because of the law of inertia, the massive blanket of nitrogen and oxygen surrounding the globe continues to move at the full speed of the rotation it was born into. At the equator, this translates to a supersonic wall of air, traveling at 1,670 km per hour. The sky does not just change color, it becomes a weapon. In the first fraction of a second, the very air in your lungs is ripped away by a vacuum, created as the atmospheric pressure gradients shatter. The sound is unlike anything ever heard in human history, a roar that transcends the decibel scale, a physical weight that crushes eardrums and liquefies soft tissue. This is not wind in the way we understand it. This is a kinetic hammer made of gas molecules, traveling faster than a jet fighter, scouring the surface of the crust clean of every structure, every tree, and every living soul. Steel-reinforced skyscrapers do not just topple. They are disintegrated. The pressure of the supersonic wind hits the glass facades, and for a microsecond, the silicon dioxide molecules scream in a frequency beyond hearing, before they are pulverized into a fine, crystalline powder. This dust is then accelerated to the speed of a bullet, acting as an abrasive that strips the paint, then the insulation, and finally the very concrete from the skeletal remains of the cities. Within 5 seconds, the great metropolises of the world, Singapore, Quito, Nairobi, are reduced to smooth, gray stains on the bedrock. The oceans follow the air. Water is dense, heavy, and possessed of immense momentum. As the rocky crust stops, the trillions of tons of saltwater in the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian Oceans continue their eastward rush. On the western coasts of every continent, the sea appears to vanish as it retreats toward the horizon at breakneck speeds, exposing the dark, jagged secrets of the continental shelves. But on the eastern shores, the nightmare arrives as a wall of water kilometers high. This is not a wave, it is the ocean itself moving as a single, solid mass. It does not break upon the shore, it erases the shore. It climbs over mountain ranges and flows into the heart of continents, carrying with it the pulverized remains of entire civilizations, grinding them against the rising terrain, until nothing remains but a slurry of organic and inorganic debris. This is the end. But to understand why, we must rewind to the beginning. For billions of years, the Earth has been a spinning top of colossal proportions, tilted on an axis of 23.5 degrees. This rotation is the heartbeat of our world. It creates the centrifugal force that bulges the planet at its center, making the Earth an oblate spheroid rather than a perfect circle. This bulge is significant. The diameter of the Earth at the equator is 43 kilometers wider than it is from pole to pole. This shape allows the oceans to remain distributed across the planet, held in place by the outward push of the spin. The rotation also fuels the Coriolis effect, the invisible hand that twists the winds and directs the great ocean currents. It is the engine of the magnetosphere, where the liquid outer core of molten iron and nickel swirls, to create a protective shield against the relentless bombardment of solar radiation. Without the spin, the dynamo ceases. Without the dynamo, the shield flickers and vanishes, leaving the atmosphere vulnerable to the solar wind, a stream of charged particles that will eventually strip the gas from our planet, turning Earth into a sterile, frozen twin of Mars. As we move past the first minute of the cessation, the internal stresses on the planet begin to manifest in a symphony of tectonic horror. The Earth is not a solid billiard ball, it is a layered onion of brittle crust, plastic mantle, and liquid metal. When the crust is forced to a halt, the momentum of the mantle beneath it creates a torque of unimaginable scale. The lithospheric plates, which usually move at the speed of growing fingernails, are suddenly subjected to forces that snap them like dry twigs. Massive fault lines rip open across every continent. The ring of fire ignites as subduction zones are forced into violent, unintended motion. Magma, pressurized by the sudden shifts in the mantle, finds thousands of new pathways to the surface. Supervolcanoes that have slept for hundreds of thousands of years are jolted awake, their calderas fracturing as the very ground beneath them buckles. The atmosphere, already a chaotic mess of supersonic winds and pulverized debris, is now choked with billions of tons of volcanic ash and sulfur dioxide, turning the sky a bruised, sickly violet. Then comes the great migration of the waters. Without the centrifugal force of the rotation to keep the oceans piled up at the equator, gravity becomes the sole master of the seas. The water begins to flow toward the poles, where gravity is strongest because the Earth is flatter there. This is a slow, relentless drowning of the northern and southern hemispheres. The northern hemisphere witnesses a new, permanent ocean that swallows Canada, Siberia, and northern Europe. London, Paris, and New York disappear under hundreds of meters of water, as the new mega-ocean stabilizes around the North Pole. Simultaneously, a similar watery shroud envelopes Antarctica and the southern reaches of South America and Australia. What is left behind at the center of the world, is a single, massive, continuous supercontinent that circles the equator, a dry, desolate wasteland of exposed seabed and towering mountain ranges that were once the mid-ocean ridges. But the physical destruction of the surface is only the prelude to the environmental transformation. As the spin stops, the concept of a 24-hour day vanishes. Instead, the Earth's position relative to the Sun is governed solely by its year-long orbit. This means a single day now lasts 365 of our old days. You would experience 6 months of relentless, unblinking sunlight, followed by 6 months of total, soul-chilling darkness. During the 6-month day, the Sun hangs in the sky, a searing eye that never closes. Without the atmospheric circulation we once knew, the heat becomes exponential. The temperature in the equatorial supercontinent climbs past 50, 60, then 70 degrees Celsius. The soil cracks, then turns to dust. Any remaining water in the interior of this new landmass boils away, creating a permanent, thick haze of steam that traps even more heat. The landscape becomes a furnace of red rock and shimmering heat waves, where the very chemistry of the surface begins to change under the constant bombardment of ultraviolet radiation, no longer filtered by a healthy ozone layer. Most turn away from the void. But here at Velastrix, we decode the math behind the chaos. Join the archive by subscribing now. On the opposite side of the planet, the 6-month night begins. Without the sun to provide energy, the temperature plummets with terrifying speed. The mercury drops to -50, then -100 degrees Celsius. The moisture in the air doesn't just fall as snow, it freezes instantly into crystalline needles that carpet the frozen oceans in a layer of white silence. The atmosphere itself begins to partially liquefy and freeze out of the air, creating exotic frosts of carbon dioxide and nitrogen. The transition zones, the areas of eternal twilight known as the Terminator line, become the only places where biological life might theoretically cling to existence. Here, the sun is perpetually on the horizon, neither rising nor setting. But even these zones are not safe. The massive temperature differential between the boiling day side and the freezing night side creates a permanent, global storm. Winds of incredible ferocity howl across the Terminator, carrying the heat of the sun side into the darkness of the night side, in a desperate, violent attempt at thermal equilibrium. Deep beneath the surface, the cessation of the rotation has silenced the magnetic field. The Van Allen belts, which once trapped lethal cosmic rays, have dissipated. Now, the solar wind strikes the upper atmosphere with its full, ionizing power. The aurora borealis is no longer confined to the poles, it dances across the entire sky in haunting, ghostly ribbons of green and red, a beautiful shroud for a fading world. These particles collide with the water vapor in the upper atmosphere, breaking the molecules apart into hydrogen and oxygen. The light hydrogen escapes into space, gone forever, ensuring that the Earth can never truly reclaim its oceans. The pressure of the atmosphere begins to change as the gases are rearranged. At the equator, the air becomes thin, mimicking the high-altitude environment of the Himalayas. At the poles, the air becomes thick and heavy, compressed by the weight of the cold and the shift in the planet's center of mass. Any biological entity attempting to move across this new world, would face not just extreme temperatures, but a crushing change in the very air they breathe. The long-term geological fate of a non-rotating Earth, is a slow transition to a frozen, lopsided sphere. Without the centrifugal bulge, the Earth eventually begins to settle into a more perfect circle, a process that triggers millennia of deep crust earthquakes, as the planet's very bones are reshaped by gravity. The crust groans and shifts, mountains sinking and valleys rising in a slow-motion adjustment to the new gravitational reality. The biosphere, as we know it, is gone. The complex chains of life that relied on the tides, the seasons, and the predictable cycles of day and night have been severed. The forests have burned or drowned, the coral reefs have been crushed by the weight of migrating oceans, or left to bleach in the air of the new equatorial continent. If life remains, it exists only in the deep crust, near hydrothermal vents, or perhaps in highly specialized bacterial colonies, within the twilight cracks of the Terminator line. Humanity, if it survived the initial supersonic winds and the mountain-high tsunamis, would find itself in a world that is fundamentally alien. We are creatures of the rhythm, the 24-hour clock is etched into our DNA, our hormones, and our very cells. To live in a world where the sun stands still, is to live in a state of permanent biological dissonance. Our technology, built on the assumption of a stable, rotating platform, would be useless. The satellites that power our communication and navigation would fall from the sky or drift away, their orbits decayed by the change in the Earth's mass distribution, and the lack of a stable gravitational bulge. Eventually, the Earth might become tidally locked with the Sun, just as the Moon is with the Earth. One side would forever face the fire, a scorched desert of molten glass and basalt, while the other would be a permanent glacier of nitrogen ice and frozen silence. Between them, a thin ribbon of perpetual shadow, where the last remnants of a once vibrant world might catch the faint, fading echoes of the wind. The cessation of the Earth's spin is the ultimate demonstration of our fragility. We live on the surface of a giant, spinning engine, protected by the very motion that we never even feel. We take for granted the invisible forces of inertia and centrifugal push, that keep the air in our lungs and the water in the basins. To stop the world is to remove the foundation of reality itself, revealing the cold, harsh physics of the cosmos, that waits just beyond our thin blue veil. We are travelers on a sapphire sphere, hurtling through the dark at incredible speeds, held together by the delicate balance of motion and gravity. When that motion stops, the balance is shattered, and the masterpiece of 4 billion years of evolution is undone in a single, silent moment of cosmic friction. The Earth remains, a silent monument in the dark, but the world, our world, is lost to the void. To explore the impossible and visualize the unknown, subscribe to Velastrix.